Hello everyone and welcome to Nimbus Maps, Basic Expert Series webinar. My name is Andrew Green and I'm the Customer Success Director here at Nimbus Maps. Today's session is all about basically creative ways to buy sites and fund them. And to do that today we have basically a wonderful expert who is all about finding finance and funding for those particular sites, which is Ian Humphreys, founder of Brickflow. If I will get him to turn on your video, Ian, and we can say hello here as well, just while Ian gets himself sorted there. Before we begin, the session will be recorded. I know we get a lot of questions asking about recordings and all of that kind of stuff. Absolutely, anyone who's registered, so if you have to leave partway through or whatever, you'll get a follow-up with a recording in there. Submit your questions anytime, and we can get to those at the end. If I see them as we're going along, I'll try and sort of feed them through. Certainly, you know, as we go through the different types of agreements, it might be quite useful to try and sort of pick some of those up as we go. So just post them in and we'll try and get them as we go along, and then we will we'll get those answered. And then finally, we've got a poll there as well. There we go. There's Ian. Apologies, Ian. I think that was my fault. I think I stopped your video there. And then we've got a poll at the end. So anyone who's interested to find out more about Nimbus Maps or find out more about Brickflow, then there's little questions there which will then feed through to the various teams, both here at Nimbus and at Brickflow, to answer those questions. Like I said, so a little bit about essentially your two speakers today, myself being one of them. So I was previously land and planning director for one of the large developers in the UK, covering the Oxfordshire region. And so, yeah, I have done option agreements, under conditional contracts. Unfortunately, in terms of a funding point of view, all relatively simple, all sort of self-funded through the company, but we've still had to think through different creative ways to do that. Because to be honest, a lot of it is dependent on your landowner and what works for them. And so you've got to think about how you're funding that scheme to be able to, one, improve your margins as a developer, and then two, find something that's going to work for your landowner as well. And I know that's even more critical when it comes down to more of that sort of SME level, where then you are having to then find that funding. And that is where Ian comes in, who is co-founder and head of lending at Brickflow. Hi, Ian. Welcome to today's webinar.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the kind intro.
Not a problem. Just rather than sort of giving us a whole... I
was just looking at those photos there. Your hair looks the same. Mine looks a bit different after lockdown.
I was going to say, yeah, you feel like you've, you know, grown through lockdown. I feel like I'm sort of stuck in time, and yeah, hopefully that means that I'll stay that way for the aging. I think you still look younger than I do. But do you want to just so that for a little bit of background to yourself, then, you know, what made you start Brickflow then?
Yeah, sure. So I was in financial services or have been in financial services for more than 15 years now. So I'd sort of seen the challenges from an advisory standpoint as to how difficult it was to get development funding for some people. And I think the key point to understand here is that, you know, and some people say this, oh, I can always get development funding. We're not talking about getting development funding, we're talking about getting the right funding. There's a big difference. You know, some people will have a bank or a lender that they use every single time. And some people are guilty of finding sites that fit that lender's criteria, rather than finding ones that fit their own criteria. And I think that's really what we're trying to do here, is rather than the lender being the focal point, what you want really is the customer, the borrower, to be the focal point. So yeah, I had as an advisor, we realized how difficult it was for us to truly know that you got the best deal in the market. There's 40, 50 lenders out there, but the market's very fragmented. None of the lenders publish their criteria. So it's impossible to anyone to truly know whether they've got the best deal in the market. So I'm also a property developer, so I've had my own challenges of getting funding when I've tried to build things. So we set about basically indexing the industry in terms of who will lend to you and at what price and how likely they are to lend to you on each site. So you can now come on to Brickflow, which is our platform, where we've got 30 lenders that feed their criteria and pricing into the back end. We then have an algorithm that takes a borrower's lending requirements or borrowing requirements, searches against those lenders, and then presents to you who's going to lend to you, the amount of money they'll lend to you and at what price. And then from there, what you do is you build out a presentation on the platform and you invite those lenders to bid on that. So it's basically creating a tender process for the finance, which makes sense because most developers, tender every other part of their business. So they do, but then the funding is kind of, oh, I'll just use this lender. So what we're trying to do is create that competitive environment for lending opportunities.
Which is only going to benefit, like I say, the developers. You can potentially squeeze down those rates and get better offers as well, so loan to values as well.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, lenders, if they know they're in the competition, then there's always that. Let's put our best foot forward and make sure we're competitive from the outset, rather than, sometimes you can see lenders offer a rate, it's not their best rate, and if you complain a bit, then it gets better. We sort of cut through all of that and we get the best offers sort of up front.
Yeah, and I think that's especially crucial, isn't it? If when you're starting out as well and unsure as to what rates you can get over time and everything. So yeah, I think it's a fantastic tool, and would recommend anyone to take a look at it really. But right into today's topic, basic creative ways to buy sites and fund them. So primarily, I'll sort of talk a little bit around sort of different types of agreements you can have in terms of between you and the landowner or you and the property owner, in terms of structuring those, and just some sort of hints and tips. And then Ian's going to then talk through some of the sort of financing arrangements you can have as part of those as well. But I think first off, you just wanted to give a bit of an overview on the market at the moment, Ian.
Yeah, sure. So lending is strong at the moment. I mean, there's a lot of interest in the development finance sector from overseas. So there are a lot of what we call non-bank lenders in the space. So I think for a lot of people, they think of the mainstream banks, and then perhaps a few specialist lenders, maybe challenger banks. But actually, there's a whole swathe of the market that some people just are never aware of. So as I said at the top, there's probably sort of 40 to 50 lenders in the market, depending on where we are in the cycle. And we did this when we were developing the platform. If you ask most developers how many lenders they can name, they normally struggle to get past 3 or 4. And if you take out the mainstream banks, then they normally struggle to name more than 1 or 2. So there's a big piece of the market a lot of people don't see, and that's partly what we do, is to give you that visibility to the wider market. But I think overall the sort of as I've touched on a bit further down, there's good political support for construction and property developers at the moment. So obviously there's been easing of planning as one just one strand of that, and I think the government sees it as a way of getting out of the sort of economic pressure that's been caused by both COVID and Brexit. So construction, as we all know, or property development is a great sort of full circle win for the economy, because it generally means that a lot of the materials and a lot of the labour is UK as well. A lot of the investor base is UK, except when you start getting up to much bigger projects. So the money that's invested, especially at the SME level, tends to stay in the UK. So it's a really good way for any economy to recover from any downturn. So the government's really pushing it hard. I think there's international interest and realization that it's a booming market. So you get a lot of American and pan-European funds looking to come into the space as well, and they're being aggressive. They want to get market share. So a lot of the mainstream banks think if you look back at the stats in 2008, pre-financial crash, mainstream banks accounted for something like 95 or even it's close to 100% of development funding, whereas in 2019, pre-COVID, they actually did less than, I think, 45% of all development funding in the UK was by mainstream banks. So there's been a big shift in the last sort of 10, 12 years away from the mainstream banks to more specialist lenders, and mainly because of the regulatory requirements for banks, the amount of capital they have to hold on their balance sheet to cover development finance loans. So the sort of specialist funds and specialist development lenders that are out there, they don't have these same requirements, so they can be more aggressive. And you also find they tend to be a bit more entrepreneurial. There's less red tape, less bureaucracy, so decision making is quicker, flatter reporting lines. So it generally tends to be a bit of a smoother experience. That said, we've got some great banks on the platform, so not saying that all banks are bad, but it can be a very different experience, I think, for a borrower to go from like a mainstream bank to someone who's a bit more specialist. The last point, sort of towards the bottom of that slide, is about the permitted development rights. So I think a lot of people are forecasting a big boom in this sector because of what's happened with COVID, and COVID's obviously a strange thing for office space, because whilst most people's requirements have gone down, there's also a bit of an equalizing effect to that, in that people now need more space because of COVID restrictions. So the amount of space, square meterage I need per person has increased, but actually most of my workforce don't want to come in every day, and therefore I'm going to reduce my overall footprint. So the sort of expectations are is that we're only going to perhaps need 60% to 80% of the office space that we needed pre-pandemic. So put some numbers on that. It's 27 million square feet of office stock in the UK. So 20 to 40% of that not being needed. So that's a huge amount of office stock that could be surplus to requirements, and that should be easy to convert under permitted development rights. But what I just wanted to highlight here is that not all of this stock is suitable for Resi conversion. So if you're a first-time developer, lenders are going to be much more willing to support you on a PDR scheme than they are on a new build scheme. That's a fact. But you need to choose your projects wisely, because we've had a couple recently where lenders have looked at it. It lends itself well to being residential, but then it's on the periphery of an industrial estate, or it's next door to, or we had one recently was at the back of a shopping precinct next to the bus depot. Lenders are not sort of looking at everything and thinking, well, fine, you can convert it, that's great, we'll lend to you. They are being quite picky on what they lend on. So think about your exit. If it's build to rent, then obviously the view is slightly different. It doesn't perhaps need to be as desirable, but if it's build to sell, then you need to look at it almost like you would a new build. Is like, who wants to live there? How easy are these things going to be to sell? So that's all that we would say is, once some of this stuff comes onto the market, just make sure that you're choosing wisely and planning ahead, and your strategy to exit is sound.
Yeah, and I think, to be honest, absolutely back up a lot of what you're saying about the PD rights. I think, this government just seemed very much set on saying, right, rather than, if we're struggling to build new build on greenfield, brownfield, let's convert a lot of the commercial stock. So we do see a lot of that changing, and a bit of what you're saying, we have the Elite Plus strategies to help you try and find those better opportunities that make more sense in terms of where they're located, rather than just saying, well, yes, that shop in the middle of the high street can technically convert under permitted development, but if you're going to have a nightmare through getting finance and a nightmare getting planning because the planners whilst they don't have many tools to stop you, there is a few elements they can have a look at and try and sort of hold you back on if they're so dead against, sort of having, the middle property in a whole high street, converting, then they're going to try and stop you. And it sounds like the lenders can anticipate that as well. And what's that demand going to be like for that particular property? So yeah, it's all about trying to find those better ones. And I think with the changes coming and in place now is a huge opportunity out there ready. It's just a case of getting out there and finding them and then speaking to the right people once you do, which hopefully is a combination of Nimbus and there we go, and Brickflow. So coming on to types of agreements, we're assuming we've found a lot of opportunities and potential opportunities. We're in discussions with a landowner. What are our options in terms of trying to structure a deal that's going to work for both parties? And typically, the types of agreements, ultimately agreement can take many different forms, but I've sort of tried to characterize it into these sort of 5 areas. Unconditional and conditional contracts, are essentially the same thing. One's just got a few conditions that you have to satisfy before it becomes unconditional. Anyone buying a house or something is essentially an unconditional contract once you've exchanged. And then it's just a matter of time before then that completion, just to allow the various processes to go on. And so from a development point of view, the only one really, like you say, that you really want to enter into in terms of an unconditional contract is that post-planning, or if you're looking at permitted development rights, knowing that you've got solid permitted development rights available for you at that particular time, because ultimately if you enter into an unconditional contract, that is it, you are buying it for the price that you said you would, and therefore you want the absolute least planning risk or any other risk because you're absolutely buying it at that price. That could be a win and a bonus. The rest of them are typically entered into sort of pre-planning, before you've realized the full value on that property, because then there's options in there for allow you to try and sort of unlock that value before then cementing into that unconditional element of the contract. So whether it's conditions, you've got to achieve planning before you can then agree to pay a certain sum, or joint venture. Now I know joint ventures could be far and wide. You can have joint ventures between different development partners who are both putting in some finance, or you've got the landowner and the developer and things like that. So there's different ways. Ultimately, it's sharing the risk fundamentally with a joint venture arrangement, or utilizing the skill sets of different sets of people. Then option agreements and promotion agreements, again, very similar. It's either side of the coin, but we'll go through those in a bit more detail. But they're typically entered into much earlier in any planning. So you're essentially having to take on all that risk of the planning. You might not be sure exactly what you're going to get. So therefore you want an option agreement, so that even if you did get planning for something, it might not be what you ideally wanted, but you can potentially sell that on, or whatever it happens to be, or just walk away and say, this isn't going to work for me. I can never get a land value out of this. So I'm going to walk away. And the promotion agreement is just being on the other side. It's being on the effectively on the landowner's side. So just looking at these a bit more detail, and what we'll do, we'll split these up. So I'll talk a little bit about the agreement, and then I think Ian's going to run through a sort of, a typical example finance that you could do with that type of agreement. But first one being unconditional contract, which, like I said, is pretty much the same as a conditional contract, except you've got set conditions in a conditional contract, which once you've satisfied those, you then end up in this situation. And ultimately, this is as simple as they get. It's just, I will pay you, so we've got this little scheme on the right-hand side here. I will pay you, whatever, £1 million for that piece of land. I'll agree that I will pay that money at a particular date. And then obviously once you've exchanged, you then complete and pay that money on that particular date. Everything is agreed up front, so there's no ambiguity. Everything that's to be agreed goes in that agreement, and that is it going forward. Obviously, you've got your land registry documents and all that kind of stuff as well, but the solicitors will deal with all of that. And basically, the advantage of this is it's really quick to progress once you have agreed those points. So like I say, once you've agreed the land value, set your heads of terms with that landowner. and away you go. Or, you know, with a property, this is, you know, interchangeable property or land, that doesn't really matter. And once that price is agreed, it's relatively straightforward. Run through all the various points, give them to a solicitor, draft them up. It shouldn't be that much going back and forth. So you're going to get, you know, lower solicitor fees and everything as well. The downsides, though, because you are committing everything up front, is you have to undertake all your due diligence up front. You know, because if we'd agreed to pay this particular landowner £1 million, and then we dig the foundations for the first 3 properties, and it turns out there's an old mining shaft or something, your landowner's already, you know, sat on the beach somewhere with his money, you're then having to cover that additional cost of, you know, your increased foundation costs as a result of finding something which you weren't aware of. You know, so that is, you need to understand everything, be very comfortable with all of your assumptions and everything going into it, because once you paid that land money across, it's very unlikely you're going to get anything back, unless you start talking about clawbacks and things like that. But landowners don't tend to agree to those. One thing you do want to be wary of, although I've heard things in the market at the moment that, to be honest, it's almost the other way, where landowners' expectations are quite high at the moment, and actually land values are probably starting to edge down slightly, relatively speaking. So actually maybe overage and clawback isn't necessarily been shouted about a lot maybe at the moment. But overage and clawback, that's typically where the landowner or the property owner will say, well, look, if you do better than what you say, I want to get a share of that uplift. So, you know, for example, here, say we said, look, we're buying this site. It's got planning for, what's that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, plus a lot of garages, 6 plots. But say we could go back in and try and get planning to turn these into 2 apartments, you know, sort of flats over garages, that sort of thing. The landowner may say, look, we think that's a possibility. We want to have a clawback that if you do get a further planning permission for some extra development, we want to get a share of that. So absolutely, you want to stay absolutely quiet on any future development plans. Don't mention anything, you know, leave that, keep that all up your sleeve for a later date. You're just basically valuing the property as it is. And so no talking about clawbacks, overages, and I'll try and really push back a lot to avoid those, because ultimately, if you're doing the work to get the extra value, you should then get the extra value. You know, the landowner by that point is well gone. And then the final one, yeah, in terms of just trying to mitigate this risk that you've got to do all the due diligence, that it's all very well saying, right, great, I will give you £1 million for this piece of land on the basis that I can just double check my reports, make sure the ground conditions are absolutely what we think they are, making sure I can definitely get my financing in place, all of that kind of stuff. You might just want to then look at trying to just agree, look, can you just give me 6 months or whatever, or 3 months to just nail all of those question marks I've got before then we formally enter into this agreement. So it's just a way of then stopping the landowner from going off somewhere else. If someone else turns around and says, I'll give you 1.1 million tomorrow, you know, you've hopefully got your little window to nail everything down, to then basically say, yes, I'm absolutely 100% committed on that particular deal. So yeah, very straightforward. And ultimately all of the different contracts will end up at this stage at the end. You know, even your option agreement, you will eventually then have to draft an unconditional contract to say, yes, we're going to buy it at that price once you've agreed it. But then, this is where you've got quite a nice example, haven't you, Ian, around how we could sort of fund an outline planning scheme, where then we look at actually phasing the scheme as well.
Yeah, so this is something that we recently completed on for a borrower, and what was quite good about this is we were able to get a really good level of borrowing, and I think the key numbers here, if you look at the deposit required, is just over 900,000, but we're matching that against a gross development value of nearly 13 million. And normally when you sort of talk about schemes with values of that sort of number, most people would think you're probably going to need, you know, 3 million, maybe even slightly more to kind of get that size scheme off the ground. And the borrower came to us and sort of said, look, this is what we want to try and do. You know, how do we get from A to B with putting in the minimum input? So Firstly, outline planning is what they had for the 63 units. It was outline plus, I would say. So a lot of I think the Highways Agency consent have been granted, and there's various other things in the pack that were there that you might not always expect with outline. But what we were able to do is actually borrow against the site with outline planning. So not a lot of people think you can do that, but you can. And what it means is that then when there's an uplift in value between the outline planning and the detail planning, which there invariably will be, that lender can potentially take that uplift in as sweat equity, which then means you reduce your equity input. So when you purchase a site, a lender's always going to look at your equity input because that's a key driver of what they will lend to you. But when you've kind of added value through the process, then they'll look to reduce your input and take a view on the value. Not all lenders will do that, but you know, the sort of lenders we tend to work with will happily do so. And so what it's meant here is that we purchased the site on technically a bridge loan. We've got a 3 to 4 month window where we're going from outline planning to detail planning. And then what we're doing is we're phasing the development into 2 phases. So I think we're doing 32 units on the first phase, 31 on the second phase. And what that meant is that because we're doing it in smaller chunks, our equity requirement for the first phase is lower than would be if we did the whole thing at the same time. So we take a bridge loan on the land, we get the detailed planning, we then split the title into phase 1 and phase 2. We keep a bridge loan on phase 2, we keep we take a development loan on phase 1. This is all with the same lender. And then we progress through, we complete phase 1, we sell down the units, and then the equity we've created from phase 1 means we don't need to put any money in to fund phase 1. We can borrow everything we need to phase 2. We can borrow everything we need to fund phase 2. So it just means from an equity waterfall perspective, the client's putting in, as I say here, less than £1 million on day 1, and that's the only equity requirement they have to go through both of those phases, which you know, for building something of this size on, you know, just over 900,000 is really, really good.
I think that's one of the key thing there. I think with that phasing is you're almost getting the benefits of almost building out 2 schemes, all linking all of that sort of financing and agreement and everything up front. So you know you've got your financing secured for the second sort of site, as it were, all up front. So even, you know, if you look back at this, you know, so say actually the planning, I don't know if you can see my mouse on here, but you know, if you had a secondary phase of another units in this sort of field through here, by then splitting that title into 2, you're effectively only getting the development on that first portion, getting the loan on that first portion, and then all the profits that you make on that first bit, and then helping you to fund the second bit. So like really reducing down you know, the financing that's going to be required to develop out that site. So I think it's a really clever approach to that. And I think ultimately what you need to do is have that factored in. So at this stage, you know, your unconditional contract, you need to have that factored in to how you want to be, you know, structuring that financing. You know, if you've spoke to Ian and the team and said, right, great, this is how we're going to do it. We've got a lender who's on board with sort of splitting the site into 2 phases. Then you just need to then have that agreed with the landowner that, look, we're going to buy it. It's going to be in 2 titles, and this is how it's going to work. And just make sure that you've got it all cleared between the solicitors, so that you can obviously develop it out as per you've agreed with the lender. I think it's a fantastic example, and just shows you how much you know you need to put in to generate quite large schemes, to be honest. The next type of agreement that we want to talk about is promotion agreement and ultimately option agreements, which are both very similar. So I'll try and sort of whiz through these a little bit sort of quicker. But ultimately, with promotion agreements and option agreements, you're effectively you're quite early on in that planning. So a bit like what you know Ian was saying with the financing, it was an outline and there's an uplift before you get to detail. typically with promotions and option agreements is you are you're well before that. You're well before outline. You're literally saying, you're looking at this field here, saying, right, we want to go and try and get planning on that particular field. And promotion agreements tend to be for much larger schemes, but you can done them. I've heard of a couple of examples where they've done it at a much smaller level, and it's essentially just a way of saying, look, I'm on the side of the landowner. So for those who are just looking to find sites to sell on, this is a great way of doing it. You basically say, look, I'm going to go and promote the site for you. I'm going to go and get planning permission on it. And basically for that, I'll get the planning permission. I'll then sell on the site to a developer because I know the developers in the area, and I'll act on behalf of you to get the best value. And my fee for that is then essentially taking 20% of that uplift in value that you're generating. So whatever you sell that for, you'll then typically take sort of 20%. It's based on the sort of risk involved, so typically on big sort of land schemes like this, it's 20%, but maybe if it's, if the risk isn't as great, then maybe, you might end up getting more like down to 15. But typically you would then also, in terms of tips, making sure you get all your costs reimbursed as well. So if you've spent £20,000 getting planning commission on your particular scheme, you'll get your 20,000 back. You sell it for £1 million, you'll then get 200,000 back as your fee for obtaining that uplift for the landowner. The advantage is, certainly with the promotion, you're both on the same side. So you're now on the side of the landowner, your best buds, and you say, look, we're here to get a planning permission that's going to drive the best value from this site. And once we do get planning, I'm going to try and get the absolute best value that we can get for this, because it's maximizing my share of the fee, and then you're maximizing the landowner's value. The way to do that, though, is then to understand what the developers want. The last thing you want to do is get planning and you find no developers actually want to buy the site because you've got some random mix of housing on there, or it's a load of flats and none of them have got balconies or whatever. It's ultimately, you need to know exactly what the developers want, so you're maximizing that value. And then, ultimately, make sure you agree that the planning costs are all deducted. And then ultimately, it's your decision as to whether you're happy with that planning permission. The last thing you want to do is end up in that agreement. You get planning permission for one type of thing, and you think you can do much better. You want to have that freedom to say, well, actually, if we keep going, I can get a better planning application to drive more value. But I just want to crystallize something first, so that we've got the precedent that's been set on this piece of land or piece of property. And then I want to go for a better one in the future. Well, you need to have that sort of mapped out and worked through with the agreement. But that's where, working with a good solicitor, you'll get that. And so very similarly with an option, you're just now sat on the other side. You're very much the developer, but doing the same role. So you're basically saying, look, your field, your property, so typically again, where there's a low likelihood of planning, or certainly in the eyes of the landowner or the property holder, there's a low expectation on planning, then you're saying, well, look, with my expertise, I'm going to go and get planning on this particular land or property. And for that, I'm going to then look for taking a discount to the open market value of 10-20%. So typically what you do with an option agreement is, because you're on different sides, you then have someone mediating between you, to sort of, to get to an agreement. But typically then you're saying, well, look, we think it's only worth $1 million. I'm sure the landowner will then be saying, well, I thought it was worth 1.5. You then got to try and, work through that negotiation, work through your figures as to why you think it's only worth $1 million in that instance. So it's a bit more protracted at that other end. And there's, so certainly for people who are quite keen to keep moving quickly, and once you've got that planning, press ahead, buy the site, and get that spade in the ground, it tends to sort of slow down a little bit, because you get into arguments around that pricing, because you're on both sides of the fence, as opposed to both being on the same side like you would be with a promotion agreement. I suppose that the great thing is, and I guess from a financing point of view, and I mean, Ian, you're saying typically when you're at this stage of the planning process, it's not going to be debt; it's going to be pretty much equity sort of investors, isn't it, at this stage?
Yeah.
And so ultimately, what you want to be doing is minimizing your costs at this stage. Well, the great thing with options is you can go through that planning, you can pretty much get it all nailed, even your detailed planning, all of that kind of stuff, get it all finalized, then try and agree that land value. And then once you've agreed that land value, that's when you're paying for it, you know, whereas with maybe a conditional contract, or maybe an unconditional contract buying an outline permission, you're laying out all of your money for the outline, your land value for that outline, and you've still got to go through the process of getting your detailed reserve matters. With an option agreement, you can get all the way through to your reserve matters agreed, finalized, and then at that point you can then pay your land value. You know, but at that point you've secured planning. Now all of a sudden it opens up your financing options to say, right, I've got planning, I've got an option agreement, so I've got to basically find some land monies and some development monies. That's when then obviously you can speak to Ian and the team, who are going to then find you what your options are to provide for that. The only sort of real, disadvantages, landowners, well, certainly from my experience, tend to want to avoid these, to be quite, I guess, persuasive in the reasons why you want an option agreement over sort of a conditional contract. And typically the argument for that is you don't know what you're going to get on the site. So therefore we can't say, you know, if we look at this field here, you know, yes, looks like there's a little access here to come in to develop this field, but can we get 50 houses on there? Is the you know, the council going to turn around and say, well, actually it's overlooking some agricultural fields, we want a nice soft boundary, you can only get 25 on there. Well, that's half the, you know, the anticipated land value if you were thinking 50 units, and now it's 25. So in that instance, you're saying, look, we can't agree a conditional contract because I can't agree a price now because I have no idea what we're going to get on that scheme, you know, until we go through the whole process. And that's why we need an option agreement where we try and maximize what we can get on the site, with then a view to then pricing up whatever we get on the site at the end. And so that's arguably the main reason why you would go for an option. So likewise, you know, maybe an old office block or something, you want to then knock that down and rebuild something in its place. How high can you go? How many units are you going to get on that scheme? It's that same argument that I need an option agreement because I just can't say for certainty where we're going to get to right now. But if you want to maximize your value, Mr. Landowner, you want to work with me to try and drive that going forward. And then some key bits here, just make sure you've got the ability to extend the agreement. Planning always takes longer. You know, councils are massively underfunded at the moment, so it'll always take longer to get those planning permissions than everyone ever thinks. And then, yeah, that valuation clause, work with a good solicitor to make sure that, you know, you're able to deduct your various costs and all of that kind of stuff, and you're still getting your discount and the way that works. Because the clearer that is when you come to that stage where you actually have to work through it, the smoother you'll be at the other end. And trust me, once you get that planning permission, every week you're not getting on site and starting to develop becomes a real pain in the backside. And so that's why it's really important on those triggers. At what point is the landowner going to basically say, well, you've got your planning, now you've got to, you know, give me an offer. You want that as late as possible and ultimately your discretion. But yeah, like I say, working with solicitors, they'll help you, you know, with those triggers through that negotiation. And this is where I think it links quite nicely into sort of deferred payments and sort of that side of things. And you've got quite a nice example here, Ian.
Yeah, so this was or is a conversion of a grade 2 listed building. Very nice looking building, and something that we were keen to fund for our borrowers. Great, like listed buildings can be more difficult to fund. Well, they are more difficult to fund. Lenders generally are a bit more reluctant to support them because of the increased risk through unknowns and increased costs that can arise due to it being listed. They're also really looking for your contractor or you as the borrower to have you know, experience of working on such properties before. So that's a key thing to understand. However, what we've done here applies on any type of property, not just a listed building. What the borrower was doing here, so again, like most of our borrowers, looking to minimize their equity input. And the purchase price of the land, I think, was 1.2 million. And then we've got a GDV of 3.2. What the figures that were coming back from lenders were the equity input was going to need to be, as I put there, 443,000, which is more than what the borrower wanted to provide. So what we said to them is said, look, why don't you go back to the vendor and ask them how much do they need now, because it's not often that the vendor needs 100% of the proceeds now. They normally have their eye on something else that perhaps they're going to develop. I mean, I think the person they were buying from was more of a sort of planning uplift guy. So buy a property either on an option or buy it outright, work the planning and then and sell on and keep the profit. So we felt there was an opportunity to approach them and strike up some dialogue and see what they actually needed now. And the guy said, well, look, I'd be happy for 800,000, 900,000 now. So what we suggested they do is actually up the offer price from 1.2 to 1.25. So you're giving the person an extra 50,000 than what they thought they were going to get, but you're asking to defer some of that to the end. So the execution price, or the price that they have to pay now, is 1.1 million. 150 is deferred until the end of the project. Most lenders would be quite happy for that landowner to have a second charge behind them for that portion. So they're well securitized. There's no risk to them, and they can secure themselves with a second charge. But what it's meant is that the lender will take almost the 1.2 value, which is what we'd say is the true value. They'll actually still use that as the lending value. So our borrower then is able to borrow the same amount of money as they would against a 1.2 million asset, but they're actually only paying 1.1 for it now. So they're actually able to reduce their initial upfront. So the end deposit, the deposit that they're putting in now, I think is about 320,000 rather than that 443, just because of being able to defer it. So it works really nicely. Again, it sort of reduces that upfront. A lot of developers, in fact, almost all, will be using other people's money as well as their own. So, equity, debt is always cheaper than equity. So we always say maximize your debt before you turn to equity. So, if you're borrowing equity, generally there's going to be a profit share, or a high sort of double-digit figure of interest, like 15-20%, something like that, or possibly, like say, a profit share instead. So if you can borrow at 7-8% and put an extra 100,000 or whatever against the site rather than using equity, then that's well worth your while.
Just a quick point here, Ian. I'm guessing the interest rate is that a typo? Is it 6.2%?
Yeah, that is a typo. So yeah, interest rate on that one. Let me think. Who did we do it with? The interest rate on that one would be, I think it's actually 8.5% on that particular one. 8.25, I think, is where we ended up. So yeah, that is a typo. Apologies for that.
But you're looking at 6-8%. I was going to say a 60% interest rate is if you're still making profit there, then you're doing something right. But I think that key thing with the with that deferred payment, again, that's arguably the option agreement is allowing you to pay your land monies as late as possible. But with the deferred land payments, ultimately, we're coming back to say that this little scheme that we had in here. You're effectively saying, well, look, I'm not going to give you all the money up front. And this is where you need to, we need to work with your landowner. All of these agreements are different options, but you've got to have a landowner or a property owner who's going to be accepting of that particular agreement. And as part of that, essentially anything's up for grabs. Like I know typically you look and you go, right, okay, I've got to pay all the money up front because I'm buying the whole site. But with a lot of schemes, I've done loads, pretty much every site we would try and look to defer some of the payment, because the land money, is typically a good third of that GDV. It's a lot of money that you're committing up front. And certainly for SME developers, you want to be minimizing all the cash at every time. And that trying to defer that land payment. If you've got a landowner who's not so bothered, maybe they want to try and split it into different, into different years or whatever, that they've all got different criteria around how they want to manage the income that's coming in from this sale, and speaking to them and how that works. Like you say, that if you're deferring a bit, sometimes, they might want a bit extra. Maybe they just want the interest, that the difference in interest that they would have got, if you gave them £1 million now versus £1 million in 12 months time, what have they lost in interest? If it's an extra 100,000, can you afford to give them 1.1 in 12 months time versus now? So again, just trying to think it through. If you can argue it through with the landowner and say, look, this is going to help me out, this is going to help me pay you more money ultimately, but you're going to have to just wait a little bit for it. And then I think it's absolutely something that should be worked through. And the final one on here is a joint venture agreement. There's a whole range of them. To be honest, this is a sort of umbrella term, I guess, for lots of different things. But I think fundamentally, it's two parties jointly sharing the risk. So it's if you're putting up with someone and you're both putting some money into a scheme, effectively you're operating as a sort of joint venture there. Or it might be that you say you joint venture with the landowner themselves and you're sharing that risk with the landowner. That's another way of doing it. So ultimately, anywhere where you're sort of working with someone, we're classing as a sort of joint venture here. And so it does make the agreements a lot more complicated, depending on obviously the arrangement. If you're both there saying we're going to put in, I don't know, whatever it was, what was the deposit required here? 443,000. So you're both saying we're going to both put in 200,000 and then we're going to share the profit 50%, at the other end of it, then that's obviously a very straightforward and doesn't add that much complexity, other than maybe some protections should one person sort of fall foul of anything. Then that's relatively straightforward. If you're working between the landowner and the developer, then you need to start thinking about how you're splitting that money. To be honest, these can get as complicated as you like. The landowner wants to get an X% back before then you start sharing the proceeds and all of this kind of stuff, which is just going to arguably cause you probably headaches around financing and all of that kind of stuff. I don't know, has the lenders got some views on funny arrangements and contracts around sort of the disbursement of profits at the end and that sort of side of things?
I think lenders generally will leave the parties to sort that out between themselves. As long as they're getting repaid and things like that, I don't think they're too worried about how it's split. But I think, just from a working relationship standpoint, you want to make sure that you're aligned. I think with all of these things, like with any agreement in anything you do, if it starts where you feel one side's getting a bigger piece of the pie or a slightly more favorable agreement, then that's only going to get exacerbated over a 2-year build program. So I think you want to go into it and make sure that you're both very happy. You hear some horror stories about joint venture agreements, but I think, the most common one you tend to see is you've got a landowner that isn't a developer, is happy for a developer to come in and effectively do all the things that need to be done and almost sit there as a silent partner, and then agree a share at the end. The key things for a lender from a risk perspective are they'll want to see that there's some equity in the scheme from one or both of the parties. So not just soft equity, not just I've owned a piece of land for 10 years and now it's worth a lot more than what I paid for it, and therefore I'll borrow X against it today and 100% of build costs. Lenders aren't going to look to release money against generally a development anyway, where you've owned it for a period of time. They want to see that there's still some hard money in there. But on a JV, especially, because the relationship could sour, and ideally, strategic alignment is important for both parties, but also for the lender as well. The way you need to look at it is a lender is an investor in your scheme. You're all looking for the same result, which is that it gets built successfully on time and on budget, and the lender gets repaid. So lenders will be interested in the relationship and the sort of mechanics of the arrangement, but ultimately it's the agreement between the two parties. I mean, there are some certain rules that you tend to see. If you're a landowner and you're bringing the developer in who's going to manage everything for you, then sort of 25% of profits is tends to be what you tend to see on that arrangement. If then the developer or contractor is looking to reduce their costs, so instead of going in on a standard contract, they're perhaps looking to build at cost, then you might see that getting closer to 50-50 in terms of the arrangement. But again, it will always depend on what the borrower's paid for the site, how much equity they've got in it. So there's a lot of factors. I think, like you said, Andrew, these things can, there's so many complications that can arise. And I would say, definitely use definitely use a decent lawyer if you're going to go into this kind of arrangement, because, there are good construction lawyers and then there are lawyers, and construction lawyers would have been through this process many times. They'll be aware of all the pitfalls, and it's worth spending that extra money on a good construction lawyer, I would say, for something like this.
Yeah, the one time when I tried to enter into a joint venture agreement, and we went to the landowner with our solicitor, and about 10 minutes into the conversation, I can't even remember the point was that the solicitor made now, but he said a few points, and you just saw the landowner and his solicitor sort of take a sort of slight sort of pensive look, and they asked to go out of the room and have a chat, and as they went out the room, our solicitor turned and said, I had a feeling that point would trigger them, and depending on what they come back with, we've got an agreement or we don't have an agreement. And they came back trying to protect their position, and and our solicitor just said, look, this is not going to work for you, and we walked away from it. So I think certainly for in my position, it was always had to rely on a very good solicitor. And I think when you look at the money that you're putting in and the money that's been made, spending an extra few £1,000s on a good solicitor is going to pay dividends in the long run. It will definitely protect you. And certainly if you look at this joint venture, you're already sharing your risk. I mean, sharing the upside potentially as well, or reducing that sort of return because you're sharing it with someone else. But you need to get this agreement right. That's the only thing I would say with a joint venture. And so then finally one, which I know is obviously a big thing right now, and obviously, at Nimbus we're doing a lot with permitted development rights and pushing those kind of developments. We thought it'd just be quite nice to have an example in here on permitted development rights as well.
Yeah, so this is actually for someone who was a first-time developer. So she hadn't built anything in her personal name before, so very difficult to normally fund someone like that. And I think why this was really good is she'd actually spent 8 months and approached 10 lenders herself, and all of them had sort of said yes and then got to a very slow no. And we were actually able to take the detail that she put into the platform and the brief, and we actually got heads of terms in about 2 hours, and we got it credit approved in 48 hours. So it was like, for her, it was just a complete different process to what she tried to undertake herself. And I think she was the first to admit it brought her to tears on a few occasions of like how painful the process can be. It is useful to have somebody guide you through it, regardless of how experienced you are. I mean, most developers are in the market probably once every 2 years for finance. I mean, this is all we do day in, day out. We speak to people from all different levels of experience, all different scheme types. So any problems, any sort of issues, questions, we've seen it all before. We know the answers, and we can guide you accordingly. And I think, there are some lenders out there, if you like, if they realize you're a bit green, they will take advantage of that. So this lady is actually in construction, so she has a construction background, which is a massive help when it's a first-time developer. But it's still quite a tricky situation to navigate. There was also problems around the value of her personal guarantee. It wasn't up to the level lenders wanted. So it wasn't an easy deal to place. But where it was good was that we were able to get the lenders take a good view on the sweat equity. So she'd owned the site for a while and she'd enhanced the planning. And so we were able to get the lender to work with most of that value that she created. And I think what really helped was she was supremely organized. So, you know, her risk, or the way she'd manage risk, was meticulous. She thought of everything. And I think like lenders are really impressed by that. You know, if you get somebody turn up with half a spreadsheet, that you know, things don't add up and whatever, is sort of, you know, lenders see that straight away as somebody that doesn't particularly have an eye for or attention to detail. And you know, if they're not thinking about how a lender's going to perceive them, then, you know, what else are they a bit lackadaisical on? So yeah, really nice scheme on the South Coast. It was an office conversion. So the block actually sat in the middle of a sort of block of houses. So there's quite a few plots of land that have been basically being muddled together to create the site. But it was, I must say, hats off to her, because she'd spent, you know, 2 years assembling the site. She'd, as I say, planned it really well, and that came through in spades in her presentation. And so it was just finding the right lender, a lender that we knew would take a view on a first-time developer, would take a view on sweat equity, and work with us. And once you have that knowledge, I mean, we collect 121 different data points from every single lender. So 30 lenders, 121 different data points, and the algorithm searching all of that every time. So you can imagine, as a human being, trying to do all of that is just impossible. So it is really like, this is a great example of where someone had spent best part of a year trying to find finance themselves, been knocked back 10 times, and then came to us, and we were able to solve the problem within, you know, a couple of hours and get it approved within a couple of days.
I think what's, you know, really encouraging is, you know, 28-unit scheme, you know, first time developer, or, you know, sort of PD rights, is just like so many people out there that we see on Nimbus Maps and thing as well. So, you know, it is there. You know, like you say, you've got to work hard, and like I say, the determination of this particular person here, you know, sort of 10 times, you know, sort of being knocked back 10 times and still pressing on. You know, a lot of development is just resilience and just keep going, you know, with all
grit and determination, for sure.
You know, to get that. So yeah, a great example. So finally, just some top tips, and just to round out, because I know we said an hour long, and we're pretty much up to an hour, so we will get to sort of questions and all that kind of stuff. So just to finalize, as we sort of briefly mentioned, use a good solicitor. Make sure you're doing as much due diligence as you can, land values, sales values, all of that. You know, all you're trying to do is just give yourself that picture. Obviously, Nimbus Maps can help with a lot of this. Understand the planning. You know, if it's permitted development rights, double check that. You know, what is the criteria behind that permitted development right? You know, I know some of them you've got to, the buildings will be built in a certain period, and all of that kind of stuff is definitely the right size that meets the criteria for that permitted development. Abnormal costs as well, you know, so, you know, work with experts who are going to then make sure you know, provide you with confidence on that, on those costs. If you're redeveloping a petrol station, you're going to have to dig out the big petrol tanks that sit underneath the petrol station. You're going to have to then backfill those. You know, what are your foundations going to be like through those? You know, you want confidence in knowing what those costs are with those abnormals. And then think about your cash flow, like, you know, Ian's mentioned with a couple of those examples. Deferring the land payment, you know, thinking about splitting up the, you know, the land into different phases. It's all just innovative ways at trying to minimize the costs up front, and then just delaying those costs to later on, which is minimizing the financing you need or minimizing the equity that you're going to have to give away to try and get you to that point where then you're unlocking the value. Like I say, there's lots of value at the end. It's about trying to push as many of those costs back to there as you can. And also looking for other ways, when you are selling units on, as their bulk sales to investors, maybe they're willing to pay up front before the units are finished. It's another way of then funding that, you reduce the loan term. And likewise, anyone who's building at the size for affordable housing, which, like I say, I've had a lot of experience with, a lot of the land gets paid for by the affordable housing. They make stage payments as you progress through the site. So the moment we enter into contract to buy a piece of land, we also enter into contract with an affordable housing provider, which says, well, for all the units they're going to buy from us as the developer, they'll have to pay us a land payment. They'll have to pay us stage payments as we're building those sites, and then we get the final bit when we hand over the keys for those houses. So all of a sudden, those ones, they're essentially funding themselves as they go through the scheme. Obviously, you're not selling them for anywhere near as much, but it's still something to really factor in. That I know there's a lot of people who are nervous about going above sort of 10 units and 12 units and moving into sites where you then have to provide affordable housing. Ultimately, if you're going to provide affordable housing, anyone else looking at the site, they're going to have to provide affordable housing. So it's not like you're going to lose out as part of one of the developers overbidding on what you're looking at, because you're all looking at it on the same basis. And it's just another thing to tender. It's just another thing to go, right, well, if we've got 10 affordable housing units, let's go and speak to affordable housing providers. Which one wants to give me the best value for those 10 units? Obviously, it's not going to be anywhere near open market value, but all of that's factored into that land price. So you're not paying as much for them either. Nimbus helps with a lot of those, obviously finding sites, searching through planning applications, finding owners, doing that company search, finding those struggling users. As Ian mentioned, with a whole lot of office space becoming redundant in the near future, that creates huge opportunities for finding sites. We have obviously the 8 ways of finding those. We've got the Elite Plus strategies to help you as well. Workflow helps you then sending out lots of letters, and planning. Obviously, then you can keep an eye on what applications are coming forward and jump on those as quick as you can. Next steps with Nimbus Maps. For all of those who aren't aware of Nimbus Maps, you can get your 14-day free trial, and you can also get a one-to-one tailored demonstration of the platform as well. I'll launch a poll where you can then click to find out those. And then ultimately, our next webinars coming up are how to find, assess, and connect with Nimbus Maps. So if you're just new to Nimbus Maps, that's a great session. That's running tomorrow at 11. And then myself and Paul, the co-founder of Nimbus Maps, will be running a property deals clinic, where if you've got a particular site you want to sort of talk through, maybe we can explore what some of the options are with that. Definitely come along tomorrow at 2 o'clock, and we can try and talk through as many schemes as we can. And then for anyone interested in Brickflow, over to you, Ian.
Yeah, so if you are interested, then leave your email address in the chat, or signify your interest, and we'll follow up. We'll arrange a follow up with you. And we also are running a webinar this Thursday at 7:30. So that's with myself and one of our lending directors, a guy called Tim Noble, who has spent the last 30 years as a banker in development finance. So he left City last year and joined with us. And what we're doing is a demo of the platform, but also then a sort of run through of what lenders want to see in deal presentations. So you get a real inside track on what lenders are looking for. So when you're putting together your sort of deal patch, your deal presentations, you can understand how they're going to look at it and improve your chances of funding.
Fantastic, excellent. So I mean, to be honest, anyone who does want to call back with Ian and the team, we've got a link in the poll, which I will launch now. So again, like we said, anyone who is interested in a trial, do tick yes for that one, if that's for Nimbus Maps. Anyone who's interested in a one-on-one demonstration, tick yes, and the team will get in touch with you accordingly. And likewise, if you want to attend the webinar we've got tomorrow at 11, let us know in that third question. And then the final one is if you want to attend Ian's webinar on, what's that, 2 days time, and then jot your details in there as well. I imagine, to be honest, Ian, I suppose we probably should have had that callback function in there, but if they take question 4, you can obviously contact them through there as well, can't you? And get their details.
Absolutely, yeah. If they want to click on that, then I can put I'll tell you what, I can put the webinar link, if you like, in the chat.
Yeah, feel free to stick that in there. So
I'll put that in there now.
Right, so I'll let that run a second and I'll get on to questions. If anyone wants to put anything in the chat, or I'll say in the Q&A, but I can't seem to find the Q&A section. And that's been disabled for today's session, so feel free to put it in the chat, and then we'll try and get through as many as we can. I suppose for Jero, what is Brickflow? In the interest of time, I will suggest that you maybe go back. You will get a recording, and Ian gave quite a nice little summary of Brickflow. Ultimately, it helps you find finance for your development schemes. I suppose is a one-liner, I guess, Ian.
Basically comparison site for development finance. So giving you full visibility of the market, essentially.
Another one for you then, Ian. You mentioned Brickflow has 30 financial providers. Are there plans to expand this, or is this a level you're happy with? That can cover the majority of funding schemes that come through. In addition to this, any plans or thoughts regarding peer-to-peer lending?
Sure.
Through the blockchain.
Yeah, so the number of lenders we're comfortable with, primarily because we've handpicked them. We know they're good lenders. There are. The industry is not that well regulated or policed, should we say? So there are still some bad apples out there, and I'm safe to say that everyone on our platform is kind of handpicked and goes through quite a rigorous DD process. So I think some people might be familiar with a lender called Lendy, who went under not so long ago, and actually a lot of developers, through no fault of their own, lost sites, lost money because they couldn't go on as a going concern. So, we're very careful about who we onboard. Lendy, we're actually a peer-to-peer lender, and I'm not saying that peer-to-peer lenders bad, but they were definitely mismanaged. Peer-to-peer lending is definitely something that is growing, and it's the future. We do have a couple of peer-to-peer lenders on the platform. Where we are really careful with peer-to-peer is to ensure that they do have alternative sources of capital. So if there was a run on the peer-to-peer element, then we still know that they're able to fund their business. So it's a key thing. People tend to think that just because I say I'm a lender that I've got a bottomless pit of money, and that's not the case. So be careful who you're speaking to, who you're dealing with. Because there are things that go wrong. So peer-to-peer is something that we're happy with when they can satisfy our requirements for, like I say, alternative sources of funding.
Fantastic, excellent. A couple of questions, probably more on the agreement side. I think there's a few more at the bottom, which I'll get to. Lal said, if a pre-planning app rejected with reasons, can a later planning app succeed with those reasons complied with? Yes, absolutely. Ultimately the planners, if the planners say we don't like it because of highways and flooding issues, if you've got a scheme which addresses the flooding issues and the highway issues, then theoretically there's no reason for them to reject it in the future. Councils, to be honest, tend to be quite sometimes if they get to, if they decide that they don't want to grant planning on a particular scheme, they will always try and find another reason. But ultimately, there's it just becomes a bit of a sort of a science. If there is no justifiable reason for them to say no, then obviously they've got to say yes. So obviously addressing any reasons they say why it's rejected absolutely opens the door for you to get a scheme ahead in the future. And then I think the other question, semi-related to that one, or sort of next to it, is from Rupert. Is promotion agreement or option more suitable when initially approaching a landowner, if not certain whether the site will be best for selling on or retaining to develop, either by purchasing from the landowner or as a JV to develop with the landowner? To be honest, I wouldn't necessarily say whether it's an option or a promotion agreement, because ultimately a promotion agreement is from that point you're setting out that you will get planning and then you will sell it on. Arguably, if you're unsure whether to sell it on or not, is just make sure you've got the ability to novate the contract. So then you could go for an option agreement, and novating the contract is essentially putting that contract in someone else's name. And then so you effectively sell on the ability to, you sell on that contract onto someone else. And then they then take over that contract and take the negotiation of the option agreement, if that's the case. Or ultimately, if you've agreed a price, it might be that you then just back to back that with someone else. So you could then say, look, I've got a site here, it's agreed, it's £1 million, we've got to pay, we've got to complete on the agreement by the end of the year. You can then go and find some developers who say, look, yeah, we'll step in and pay 1.1 or something, and then you're taking the difference between the two. So I would, if you're unsure as to what to do, then always go for, you're going to develop it, and then obviously you can sell on that contract onto someone else. The only thing I would suggest is with your solicitor, just say, make sure that you have the ability to novate that contract to someone else, and then that will keep you covered for all angles, really. Right, we've got a load of questions at the bottom here. One for you, Ian. What is Brickflow's typical fee charge in addition to the lender's fees?
So we charge a commitment fee of £995. So the way the process works is you complete a search, you complete an application, and that goes off to lenders. They then submit their heads of terms back to you. So there's no fee for any of that. But if you want to get any one of those loans credit approved, then that's when there's a commitment fee charged. That's returned to you in the event that the loan isn't approved.
Okay, fantastic. Right, so someone's saying Vajero, which I'm not sure I'm saying your name correctly, so apologies if not. It turns out we have a clash of webinars. I've just realized, yes, we do have a webinar on Thursday at 7 p.m.
Oh, do you?
And then someone else is saying, is there a recording available of the Brickflow one? Well, I can say there's definitely a recording of ours. So if you put your name down to attend and don't attend, then you will get access to a recording of ours. I'm guessing yours is recorded as well, Ian?
Yes, we'll be recording as well. So best thing to do is if you register for the webinar, the link I've just put in here, then what we'll do is we'll make sure that a recording sent to everyone that registers.
Yeah, fantastic.
Bharat seems to want to know about PGs.
Yes. What about PGs? Yes. What happens if you're unable to give any?
So in short, I mean, there aren't any lenders really that will lend to you without some form of recourse. The only way you can get around that is if you reduce your leverage. So I mean, there are ways and means around it. I mean, typically most lenders want 20 to 25% of loan amount. And there's a really good article on our website actually about personal guarantees, just explaining them in more detail. But the thing to remember is they're conceptual security, not additional security. So what you're saying, you're signing something to say that in the event that the build costs go over budget, or the properties are sold and the lender loses money, 20 to 25% of the loan amount, so borrowing $1 million, 200 to 250,000, if there was a loss to the lender up to that amount, you effectively will cover it. How you cover it is up to you. But if you refuse to cover it, then they can force you to sell assets. So you're not giving a charge over of a property. You're just saying in the event that something goes wrong, that you will you will make good on your promise. When you say can't give any, anyone can give a personal guarantee. The key is whether it's actually worth anything. I mean, the way lenders assess it generally is they'll look at background properties you have, or shares. Barrett's just say if you don't own a house. If you don't own a house, is going to be tricky, because property tends to be the main thing that lenders like. We did do something a little while ago where the borrower owned a site and was looking for funding for that, and was in rented accommodation, didn't have any other assets. What we did there is that the lender was happy to take a 10% cash deposit of loan amounts, rather than 25% notional on the balance sheet of their balance sheet. They basically said, look, we'll take 10% in real cash. So he put an amount in escrow that sat with the lender, that was, at their call in the event that something went wrong. So there are ways and means around it. Another way would be to get somebody else involved in the project that could provide that personal guarantee. The other way is reducing your leverage. So if you borrow less than 50% loan to GDV, then there are lenders that will allow you not to have any recourse. The other thing you can do is get the contractor to take a performance bond. You can sometimes get your guarantee reduced to cost overruns only. But yeah, I mean, essentially, without property in the background, it's going to need to be cash or somebody else that can come on the ticket, if you like, as a shareholder to say, look, well, I'll pledge my balance sheet to cover the PG.
Fantastic. And then last question, is it possible to get 100% development finance, or must there be, well, they've suggested 30% equity, but I suppose, what is that typical sort of minimum threshold for
yeah, so it is possible to get 100% development finance, supposedly. We don't actually offer it. Just for everyone's benefit, what tends to happen is it will be somebody that has their own money, and all they do is they go to a development lender on your behalf, and then whatever equity requirement there is needed, they'll plug it themselves, and then they charge an uplift on the whole piece. So it is and can be quite expensive, but it is a good way for perhaps if you're in construction, certainly to get started, because you might be able to earn more money than a regular contract, which then hopefully your second or third scheme you can probably roll into and have some of your own money to get off the ground, rather than using 100% funding. But typically, and the platform does this really nicely, lenders will ask for anything between sort of 10% and 30% equity. So 30% would be really at the upper end of where the market sits, and this is of total cost. So this is your land cost, your build cost, and lender cost combined, and it's 10% to 30% of that number. So 10% of a site where you're paying $1 million for the land, and $1 million build costs, and then perhaps there's a couple of $100,000 of lender costs. 10% is 220,000, whereas 30% is 660,000. So it's going to make a huge difference to you, that if you're only dealing with a lender that works on a 30% deposit, you're going to have to find 3 times the deposit. So all I would say there to Addy is that come onto the platform and put your site details in, and you'll see what's possible. And hopefully there's a lender that will allow a 10% deposit, that will be happy to look at your deal.
Fantastic, excellent. I think we've got everything. One final quick one. I'm conscious of time here. Does the process become easier, quicker, more comfortable for returning clients, building up that relationship through the Brickflow process, if you've got people coming back for finance second and third, fourth times?
Yeah, I mean, we've got one I mean, we launched 9 months ago, and we've got one guy who's been back 4 times already. I think where he used the same lender every time. He's done sort of 18 developments, and so he's a very good developer into his own contracting business as well. And where he sort of found it super useful to use us is that we're pretty much, we can use a different lender each time, and that's not done deliberately. It's because the way lenders calculate development finance is that every single site they will give you a different. So if better way to explain this probably, if I go to 10 different lenders on any site, they will give me 10 different borrowing amounts and 10 different pricing. So what we're trying to show people is actually speaking to the same lender every time will mean you get a suboptimal solution. So you'll either be putting more equity in than you need to, or you'll be paying more your pricing, your cost of funding will be higher than the market, the rest of the market might need to be. So I think the point to sort of get across actually is what we do is by doing that search across 30 lenders every time, is you're guaranteed to get the best deal in the market. And going back to the same lender every time, there's almost a 0% chance that you're going to get the best deal from them every time, regardless of any previous relationship. I mean, obviously it can be easier to deal with the same lender again, because there is that perhaps rapport and understanding of how each other works. And of course you can do that, but I think from a borrowing perspective, in terms of making the most of your equity and making the most profit on each scheme, using the same lender each time is not the way to do that.
Fantastic, excellent. I think we have covered all the questions, and we're frantically using everyone's time. So I really do appreciate everyone's time here today, and I'd just like to extend my thanks to Ian for coming on and talking all about development finance today. Thank you, Ian.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, Andrew. Always a pleasure.
Fantastic. And on that, and thank you very much from me as well. Like I said, we've got sessions running tomorrow and Thursday, and likewise with Ian as well. So hopefully we'll see you all again on a future webinar. My name has been Andrew Green. We've been Nimbus Maps. Thank you very much. Bye-bye now.